Okay, welcome back, everyone, from lunch. I'm pleased to moderate this final panel that is entitled Continuity and Change in the Gulf, How Stable and for How Long? This is a provocative title, but what I really intended for this panel to do is to really take stock of many of the themes that we've already heard in these lively panels, and to sort of do two things. I think one is to project forward into the future and address these questions of sustainability and change. How might change come about? What are some likely scenarios? And then also to address the policy implications of this for the West and the United States. What are these states doing? What should they do? And joining me, I think we've got a top-notch panel for you. To my right is Christian Coates-ulrichsen, recently of the London School of Economics. He's now at Rice University as a fellow. He's the author of a very important book on the Gulf that I think really encapsulates many of these themes that we've heard about today that I know is on the syllabus of several college courses. Insecure Gulf, the End of Certainty, and the Transition to the Post-Oil Era. He works extensively on the Gulf. He's also a historian by training, extensive experience in Kuwait, Bahrain. He's also working on a book on Qatar and the Arab Spring. We're also joined by Bernard Heikel of Princeton, someone I think who needs no introduction. He's someone I think who really blends together the disciplines of history, anthropology, and policy analysis. Well known for his work on Yemen. He is now writing a book on Salafism, and of course he's a student of Saudi Arabia that has, I think, unprecedented access to that country. And finally, Mark Lynch, who's known to you as the previous moderator, professor of political science at George Washington University. Someone I think that can really integrate these themes into a policy perspective on the United States. And I should also add he's the author of a book that I think really anticipated many of these new media trends and their effect on political dissent in the Arab world. So with that, I'll turn it over to Christian.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Fred. It's been a rich day of discussions, and I think I'd like to pick up on some of the trends and the issues that have been touched upon to look ahead. And to say that perhaps on one reading, it could be argued that the Gulf states have confirmed their position as the great survivors of Middle East politics. Going back to the 50s, the talk of the King's Dilemma, the kind of modernization would sweep away the Gulf states. They've survived the Arab Spring, the initial onslaught, and they're looking stronger than ever in some respects. Especially now with, for example, austerity and crisis in Europe. You see huge acquisitions by Qatar, the Emirates, and other Gulf sovereign wealth funds buying up and privatized state assets across southern Europe. Real opportunities that are opening up for them. However, I'd argue that that's a potentially short-term view of stability, and I'd posit the issue as one of short-term stability against longer-term challenges. In a sense, Gulf states have managed to kind of ride out that initial storm that was raised 2 years ago. The uprising in Bahrain has been largely contained, if not resolved. Kuwait went through a period of profound crisis, and again, I guess everyone's waiting for the Constitutional Court ruling next week before deciding what to happen next. But at what cost? At what cost have some of the measures taken over the past 2 years created larger challenges for the future? And how is that changing the Gulf politically and economically? I'd just like to pick up on one of the issues that I think came out in the first panel especially, which is that one of the legacies of the past 2 years is the intersection of a number of trends, the politicization of new groups of people across the region through the Arab Spring, with the impact of the youth bulge, the fact that in the Gulf, as across the Middle East, there are large groups of young, overwhelmingly youthful populations under the age of 25 to 30, wired together as never before, incredibly internet savvy, technological savvy, highest rates of smartphone penetration as befits high-income developing countries. Really new game, new rules in terms of reconfiguring the political landscape in unpredictable and dynamic ways, which are superseding and really undermining and eroding the carefully constructed lines of political participation that were created to give the veneer of a kind of pluralist participatory system in the Gulf over the past 30 to 40 years in Kuwait and Bahrain, more recently in the last 15 years elsewhere. The kind of official oppositions that have been allowed to have certain amount of space to kind of give that kind of veneer of plurality. These new groups, by contrast, overwhelmingly leaderless, youth-led, using Twitter and Facebook and social media to organize online and debate and discuss as never before, are showing that they're willing and able to shatter hitherto sacrosanct red lines, for example, direct criticism of the rulers, and are really calling into question these issues of transparency that we were discussing in the past session. For example, in Kuwait, you had Musallam al-Barak directly threatening the Emir of Kuwait, warning him not to drag Kuwait back into the abyss of autocracy. And then you had thousands of people picking up his chant of "We will not allow you," in a kind of a state of mass civil disobedience after the ruling Al-Sabah Family Council had called for public obedience to the Emir. And then, of course, the fact that he was then sentenced to 5 years in prison, and then he actually, in a trial of strength with the Kuwaiti government, the government and the security services were unable to arrest him and to bring him to prison. So this kind of trial of strength, which is reconfiguring the landscape, as in some ways the old established political oppositions are struggling to adapt to this highly politicized and much more forceful youth-led groups which have emerged. So the kind of political reconfiguration is as much a challenge for the official oppositions as it is for the ruling families, is introducing a new level of uncertainty into the political landscape as a whole, not just in one direction. In Bahrain, for example, as I think was mentioned earlier on, we have a national dialogue, perhaps an example of an old-school attempt to try and bring parties together to hammer out a new form of kind of ruling bargain. But to what extent can Wafaq speak for the February 14 movement is very unclear, if not impossible, the same way that the ruling, kind of the Sunni communities are now outflanking the ruling family and the official kind of organs of the Bahraini state in calling for much more direct forms of action. So we're seeing a kind of reconfiguration of this landscape and a generational gap opening up between elderly regime leaders and overwhelmingly youthful population, which, as the kind of pace of change speeds up with the internet, with social media, is going to become increasingly hard, I think, to sustain or to kind of keep a lid on. And we've seen some of the reactions over the past 2 years, the attempts to jail people for Twitter usage, the 11-year jail sentence handed out to a woman in Kuwait just this week. I mean, this is almost like building a fence in front of a tidal wave. It betrays a sense of insecurity and unease, but not much more of a kind of viable alternative to try and come up with a viable solution. Again, in the last session, there was a statement about Alexis de Tocqueville, kind of regimes that are the weakest link when they have to try and reform. And this is the interesting thing, I suspect, looking forward, that some of the pillars of the ruling bargain, which were kind of touched on in the past session, are now coming under incredible strain as never before. We talked about governance a lot. The technocratic solutions, the instinctive reaction of the Gulf states over the past 2 years has been to try and intensify the politics of patronage, to kind of, in a sense, throw money at the problem, the enormous spending packages that were begun in Kuwait, actually, by the Emir of Kuwait in January 2011, I think maybe a couple of days before even Ben Ali had fallen from power, and framed very much as a gift for celebrate 50 years of independence, 20 years of liberation, and 5 years since the Emir took power. But very quickly, of course, became superseded by the need to try and guarantee some form of social stability, to kind of buy off some of the disaffected elements that have been energized by the Arab Spring. The Saudi package of more than $130 billion was perhaps the prime example, but this has happened across the Gulf, even in Qatar, with very little of a domestic opposition. They're announcing 60% pay rise for civil servants and 120% for military officers. This kind of element of intensifying the politics of patronage has really been an issue that is storing up long-term problems, because in situations like the Gulf, where the redistribution of oil income has been a key element of that ruling bargain, it's much easier to give something than it is to take it away. And each handout incrementally increases that cost of eventually trying to kind of draw in some of those unproductive payoffs that have been made over the past decades, in fact. And so we've seen that reflected in the rapidly rising break-even price of oil, which in the UAE, for example, has gone from $23 a barrel in 2008 to $92 a barrel in 2012, according to the IMF, the kind of rate at which a government needs to kind of balance its budget. In Saudi Arabia, it was about $20 a barrel in about 2001. It's over 90 now, and some estimates have been that the 2011 spending packages added about $16. In Kuwait, it's officially about 40 to 50, although the acting Minister of Finance surprised a lot of people last year when he estimated it would be more than 110, in fact, right now, and potentially $230 a barrel by 2030, unless serious measures were taken to try and wean the government away from such unproductive payoffs. So these long-term increases are creating trouble, obviously at the time of sustained high oil prices for the past 12 years, give or take a year or so in 2009. There's a lot of kind of stored up wealth, huge budget surpluses every year, but the room for maneuver is shrinking. And that ties into the second element of kind of potential long-term, well, kind of existential long-term threat, if you will, which is the rapid increase in energy, domestic energy usage. Domestic energy consumption is shooting up through the roof. Again, it's bound up with this kind of pillar of the ruling bargain, the fact that services and kind of utilities have been long provided at the point of being free almost in many states. And again, it intersects a number of trends, the kind of energy-intensive industrialization that has formed the core of the attempted diversification packages, petrochemicals, for example, in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, and cement production elsewhere. It focuses on population growth, it's urbanization. If you've been to any of the huge Gulf cities with the massive skyscrapers, you'll know that they're not necessarily built in harmony with the environment, and they're probably quite unsustainable. But the issue of the kind of long-term energy consumption issue, going up 10% a year in some cases, again is going to be an existential problem for the rulers to try and face, because Gulf states will only make money from exporting oil. They do not make money from actually producing it and then diverting it to very unproductive domestic subsidy patterns. So again, these are some of the issues which, if I were a Gulf ruler, they would certainly be the ones keeping me awake at night, not necessarily some of the issues that we've talked about this morning, of course, although of course they are all interlinked, because as you have a much more energized population able to hold people to account in ways as never before, then inevitably some of these long-term challenges and trends will become openly discussed and become much more difficult for rulers the longer they try and put it off, to try and keep control of the pace and the extent of reform. So I suspect that what the Gulf is facing right now is a challenge between incremental and consensual forms of reform, as, for example, Ali Al-Jahabi was talking about this in the previous panel, or whether that reform will be dragged out of Gulf rulers, dragged out from bottom-up pressures that they will no longer be able to control. And if that were to happen, of course, it would be a very different scenario looking forward than the first. And if I were to venture a personal opinion just before I sign off, I'd say that nothing that's happened over the past 2 years, or perhaps longer in terms of past many years, has really convinced me that ruling families in the Gulf are genuinely prepared to make meaningful changes to the structural balance of power within Gulf societies. And so this is a fundamental issue which I guess will have to be grappled with over the time as developments continue to accelerate and change takes place at an increasingly fast rate. Thank you.
Thank you. Bernie?
Okay, I would like to begin by thanking Fred Weary, the Carnegie Endowment, and the Project on Middle East Democracy for inviting me. And I will begin by, the task is to sort of look forward, right? And to summarize some of the past panels. We have 10 minutes, is that
15,
right?
15
minutes,
15,
okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to, putting it crudely, there's a rule of thumb in Saudi politics which is often mentioned to visitors, and that is whenever you ask where is all this going and how sustainable is the situation, the Saudis who are using this rule of thumb will say, tell me where the price of oil will be in 2020 or 2025, and I will answer your question. By which they mean that if the price is high and the rulers are able to dispense largesse in this patronage system that was just described, then things will just keep humming along. And if the price is not there, then the pressures will build up and eventually may cause the system to break down. Now, I have two countries to cover here. The first is Saudi, and I will talk mainly about Saudi Arabia, and the second is Qatar. So as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, there's a ledger here that I'm going to present to you. Sort of the assets that the country has and some of the weaknesses or liabilities. On the asset side, in terms of the Arab Spring, most immediately, Kristen and Ali have already alluded to this, people there they have a lot to lose, and they don't want to see domestically what is happening in Iraq and Syria and Yemen to happen at home. And that gives the regime considerable staying power. Also, as a historian, I should tell you that this is not a regime that was created by colonial design or strategy. This is a regime that is historically rooted and that goes back to the 18th century and has considerable legitimacy because of this. In addition to which, this is not unlike other regimes in the Middle East, what one political scientist has called a one-bullet regime. In other words, you can kill King Abdullah tomorrow. There are many princes who can step up and become king. It's not like the regime of Saddam or Gaddafi in Libya, where if you got rid of the ruler, it would be over, or you would have a very strong likelihood of it being over. There are at least 6,000, or if not 7,000, princes and princesses in Saudi Arabia, and quite a few of them, if not many of them, feel that they are entitled to the position. Next on my ledger of the positive assets of the regime is that, like any good authoritarian regime, I think the Saudi royal family has been able to instill in its people the strong sense that without them the place would fall apart. Okay, so good authoritarian regimes always, in the imaginary of people, preclude the possibility of an alternative that is viable. And they have been very effective at this, and I think there's good grounds for them to have promoted this view, because it's hard to imagine the country geographically, where with its assets being allocated in the way its natural assets being allocated in the way that they are, keeping together if the Saudi royal family is not there to rule it. In addition to which, and the list goes on in terms of assets, they have considerable economic power. We know that in response to the Arab Spring, a regime that normally does not take decisions very quickly, but consensually, and often it takes a very long time for them to decide on anything. In fact, if you look at Saudi history, when they have been confronted by something they had to take a decision on, by the time they actually reach the decision, the problem has come and gone. They no longer need to take the decision. So having done nothing has bailed them out over repeatedly in the past.
These are strengths.
These are strengths, yes. I mean, consensual politics can be strength. In any event, they do have considerable economic power. They created the 300,000 new jobs. 60,000 new jobs just in the Interior Ministry of the Interior, 500,000 housing units, increase in salary of 2 months for everybody in the public sector. The private sector had to match these increases in order to remain competitive. I mean, this is a regime that has over $700 billion in cash assets. Okay, and by the end of the year, they'll have $1 trillion in cash assets. The only other country that supersedes Saudi Arabia is China, in terms of U.S. Cash assets, and mainly in U.S. Treasuries. In addition to this, this is a regime that dominates its society entirely. It masters and controls the religious politics of the country. It has a religious establishment, but it also has deep ties into the non-official religious groups. It is very adept at the politics of fragmentation or segmentation, and which allows it to further dominate its society. And lastly, and I'm sure there are other assets, lastly, it has U.S. protection. Okay, the Americans, for reasons that have nothing to do with how beautiful the Saudi royal princes are, the U.S. will come in and very likely defend this regime simply because losing 9 to 10 million barrels of oil in daily production would disrupt the world economy and would mean that our way of living would cease if this country were to become unstable and if the supply of oil were not to be reliable and steady. So that's the plus side of the ledger. On the weaknesses, there are very significant weaknesses as well. In terms of foreign countries that represent a threat, an immediate threat to the kingdom, you have Iraq, and you have to the north, and you have Yemen to the south. Iraq represents a dual threat, I think. One is if Iraqi oil were to ever really seriously increase and become significant, let's say over 5 or 7 million barrels of oil production a day, that would diminish Saudi Arabia's power in the global oil markets. And secondly, and more importantly, Iraq is a military threat to Saudi Arabia. If the Iraqi regime gets its act together and rebuilds its army, it could invade the eastern province quite easily, unless the U.S. makes it very clear that this would be unacceptable, and there would be a very heavy price to pay. Yemen is a different kind of threat. Yemen is a threat of a country that is nearly failed as a state. It has the largest population on the Arabian Peninsula, with 25 million people, many of them poor, hungry, and extremely jealous of the Saudis, and they could just literally walk across that border should Yemen implode. And that would be a very significant threat to the regime. In terms of additional weaknesses, of course, social media is construed as a weakness, although to my mind, and this is a takeaway that I think I've gotten from Mark's work, is that, social media is powerful, but only if it's matched by sort of a physical reality, if you can actually mobilize in real space and time. And that we have yet to see happen in the kingdom. It might happen, and the kingdom, there's talk or rumors that the kingdom is thinking of setting up a 100,000-man security force to deal with the possible mobilization of its own people. That, I think, would represent, if that were to happen, and if these forces were to open fire on their own people, that would really change the nature of the relationship that this regime has had with its people, and could be a serious source of instability. The other weakness, and this is where there's the greatest amount of opacity or opaqueness, are the internal family politics within the Al Saud, within the royal family. And here rumors talk of divisions, of rivalries, and which no doubt exist, like in any family. And the politics of all families are very sticky, and this family is no different. My worry in terms of the family politics of the Saudi royal family is that they might become so involved in their own rivalries that they would, as it were, turn their faces towards each other and their backs to the society. In other words, not pay attention to what's going on in society because they're so consumed by their internal affairs. And that would be a serious weakness because they have to keep their eye on what's happening in their society. So these are some of the weaknesses that I see, and of course there are additional ones that were mentioned earlier: a real demographic problem, jobs, diversification of the economy, water, increased consumption of electricity and fuel and water. Saudi Arabia is the second largest importer of barley in the world because they have this insanely subsidized system where they produce livestock and milk and so on by feeding animals this subsidized commodity. So there are lots of inefficiencies in the system that need to be addressed, and they are very difficult to address because you have constituencies that are formed around these subsidies, and people feel that these are entitlements that they are owed by the government. So there are lots of other weaknesses in the system. I will return to Saudi Arabia at the end of my remarks. Let me turn to Qatar. So Qatar is you cannot compare it to Saudi Arabia. Again, I would echo what Ali said earlier. You were talking about a city-state, and it is the most city-state of all the city-states of the Gulf, in the sense that you have a native population of 200,000 to 300,000 people. If you divide, officially the per capita GDP is 96,000. I think if you exclude the foreigners, it's closer to 600,000 per person. I mean, it's, ours is 50,000. I mean, they're so much richer than us, and we're the richest in the world. And so their problems are sort of Disneyland problems, you know. They're not real problems, and given their population. And the place is run by the emir, essentially, from what I can tell. He micromanages everything. He has two characters around him, one in the form of the foreign minister and prime minister, known as HBJ, Hamad bin Jassim, and his wife Moza, and he attributes policies to these two individuals, which then allows him for plausible deniability should these policies fail. But in fact, he is the one who's taking the lead every time, and now there's been talk that he will devolve, or he will actually transfer power to his son, who is the crown prince. You know, I don't know what to make of Qatar, and I think you know the country better than I do. Very often their policies, both domestically and regionally, are puzzling. And I think that since it's not institutionalized, and since really it all depends on the whim of one individual, it's very difficult to create analytical categories or grids by which to understand how Qatar functions, other than writing checks, of course. Which is a constant. Now, let me end by briefly mentioning the United States, and I know I'm stealing some of your thunder here, but no doubt we'll disagree on some issues. It was mentioned, that Kerry had been to our Secretary of State Kerry had been to Saudi Arabia and was silent. Had nothing to say about the arrests and trials of some of the Saudi dissidents. And you can see, in fact, that this is a part of a trend that I think, as far as the Arab Spring is concerned, started with Bahrain. It became very clear, I think, to the Obama administration that Bahrain was a red line for the Saudis, that Saudi Arabia would decide on what the policy towards Bahrain would be, and that the U.S. would have very little to say about the matter, namely that the Khalifa regime would remain in power come hell or high water. Because no power would be devolved or given to the Shi'is of Bahrain, because for a number of reasons. The Saudis really believe that Iran is behind this. It's a convenient scenario also to think that Iran is behind it, because you need to rally your own Sunni base of supporters around an enemy in the form of the Shi'is, whether in Bahrain or in Saudi Arabia. I can elaborate on this if you want in the question and answer period. But the U.S., as far as I can tell, has understood that there is very good reason to not push Saudi Arabia on the Shi'i question, on the Bahrain question, and it has not done so. It has not exerted any pressure. In addition to which, you have a situation with our present administration that is, more and more disconnected from the region. We are exhausted as a country, having spent a lot of money in Iraq and in Afghanistan. We're pulling out from Afghanistan soon, and I don't think the president can be bothered by anything that's happening in the Middle East, because what good can come from it? You're not going to win votes. You're not going to. It's just a source of constant grief. And the president was, I think, disciplined fairly early enough, beginning with the Israeli-Palestinian file, that it's not worth doing anything in this region, because as I said, only grief comes from it. So, given that you have the U.S., as I've described it, not involved or interested, and given that you have the scenario that I mentioned with the price of oil being what it is, and the capacity that the Saudi state has at its disposal, not to mention that of Qatar, I doubt that that either regime, the Qatari or the Saudi, are going anywhere soon. They are here to stay, and for all the reasons that I outlined. And I will end on that note.
Thank you. Thanks. Please, Mark.
Great. Sorry for interrupting you, but that was funny.
That's fine.
I'd like to thank Fred for the invitation. This has been a really astonishingly good conference, and after listening to this parade of real Gulf experts, I'm painfully aware that I'm here only because Steve Simon had to catch a train.
No, come on.
That said, let me try and at least offer a few remarks, I think more perhaps from a broader regional perspective, and maybe applying some of the lessons, which I think that as academics and analysts we've learned from the Arab uprisings, to what might or might not unfold in the Gulf. And but I want to say a little more than has been said thus far about Syria and how that might end up shaping politics in the Gulf in ways that haven't really come up. And then say a few words about U.S. policy. And the one area where I think Bernie and I do disagree is in how we might characterize how President Obama has thought about the region, although the upshot of it might ultimately be the same. So first on the question of how to interpret the nature of change in the region and the Gulf's place within it. I generally see what has happened in the region, the Arab uprisings, the revolutions or uprisings, whatever you want to call them, in Tunisia and Egypt and Libya and Bahrain and every place else, as part of a pretty deep and broad structural change in the nature of politics in the region as a whole. And I think that this is driven by some pretty deep structural factors that have been unfolding for quite some time and are going to continue to unfold for the next few decades. And the enormous and I think unprecedented kind of coming together of multiple drivers in January through March of 2011 was certainly dramatic and certainly something which we should study on its own terms, but in many ways it's epiphenomenal. In other words, this was something which is only a manifestation of the deeper underlying changes. Among those deeper underlying changes, I would focus, and this is maybe my own personal thing, but I do think it matters, in the revolutionary change in the nature of how information is developed, shared, flows, and operates within the politics of the Middle East and of the world. I mean, I think that if you go back to 20 years ago, where authoritarian regimes were able to exercise pretty darn near monolithic control over the distribution of news, distribution of opinion, the ability to express views in public, and in terms of fragmentation and segmentation, the ability to prevent different parts of society from engaging with each other or talking to each other, there were common strategies of survival across the monarchies and the republics, across the rich and the poor states, across the Baathists and the royals, that basically relied very heavily on the ability to control the flow of information. And that is just absolutely, completely, 100% gone. It doesn't mean that governments are no longer able to try and shape or direct or influence the nature of political information. And in fact, in a few minutes, I'll come back to the way in which what's happened in Syria has been used quite enthusiastically by authoritarian regimes to instill fear in their own people of the possibility of change, just as they did with Iraq in the mid-2000s. It doesn't mean that the regimes give up, but this is a fundamental structural change. One of the absolute pillars of Arab authoritarianism is simply gone. And this is why, for example, when I look at Saudi Arabia, I tend to see a much deeper and more fundamental change than most of my more experienced and smarter friends from Saudi Arabia, because what I see in Saudi Arabia is one of the most wired and media-saturated societies on earth. Highest YouTube consumption per capita of any country in the world, the highest and fastest growing rate of Twitter use in the world, combined with an almost very, very high degree of efforts by the state to maintain control, rigid control over the public sphere and the manifestation of politics on the streets, as Bernie was pointing out. In other words, when I look at Saudi Arabia, then what I see is a society which has been deeply, fundamentally shaped by these underlying structural changes, and yet has not seen the manifestations or the symptoms of that yet emerge. There are others, of course. I think that the decline of America's power and what I like to call the right-sizing of its military political presence in the region is going to have deep structural effects in terms of the survival and the orientations of regimes, and we're only beginning to see the early stages of how that's likely to affect these regimes. I think that the youth bulge is enormous across the entire region. It came up in the second panel, the questions of youth unemployment, but there's also just the way that youth experience society and states. I think that this generation really does simply have different expectations of their rulers, of states, and they are deeply, deeply disenchanted across the Gulf, across most of the Arab Middle East, with not only regimes, not just leaders, but with almost all institutions, with political parties, with NGOs, with the official mainstream media, with tribes, with you see this across almost every sector, this deep disenchantment and just almost disgust with their elders who have failed them in almost every way. Sorry to those of you who might be among those elders, but I include myself here at this point, I'm sad to say. The point here is simply that these are deep structural changes that are continuing to unfold, and we've only seen the very beginnings of how they're going to matter. So often when I hear debates about stability in the Gulf, to me it sounds like the debates that we were having about Egypt in 2007, 2008, where everybody was able to identify all of the pathologies in Egyptian politics, the crumbling infrastructure, the stagnant political system, the corruption, the disappearance of the middle class, the rising discontent. We could all see it. But people said, no, but Egypt never really changes. They always find a way to manage their problems. They always manage to figure out a way to just muddle their way through. And so then you get to January 25th, and suddenly it's like, wow, nobody saw it coming. And of course they saw it coming. What they didn't believe was that all of those things would add up to sudden, shocking, discontinuous change. And so I am much more pessimistic or optimistic, depending on the valence you put on it, about the stability of the Gulf, any of the countries of the Gulf, in the 5 to 10 year window. Doesn't mean that I think this isn't like Bruce Riddell saying that we're going to see a rolling revolution in the streets of Saudi Arabia tomorrow. Or Chris Davidson even saying they're all going to fall within 5 years. But I do not believe in the idea that the Gulf regimes, A, have been unaffected by the Arab Spring. I think this is palpably and obviously untrue. Bahrain had the largest per capita protests of any country in the Middle East. Oman had the largest labor protests and political protests probably in its modern history. Kuwait has had its largest protests in modern history, had the parliament dissolved, had kind of massive changes in the nature of political engagement among its citizens. Even Saudi Arabia, although we can talk more about that. I mean, I just fundamentally disagree that the Gulf has escaped the Arab Spring. I disagree with any suggestion that there's a monarchical exception, that there's some idea that monarchs are more legitimate or resilient. I do think that they have been more able to respond to the challenges from below because they have a lot more money. I think $700 billion in cash on hand goes a long way. I think unflinching external, not just American, but also European political support out of terror of what would happen about revolutions in the Gulf gives them a combination of free hand to repress dissent at home and feeling that they can probably get away with it if they take human rights activists and disappear them into prisons, torture them, take away their passports, and be pretty confident that even if the Assistant Secretary for Democracy in the State Department says some good, courageous things, as Mike Posner did, and he deserves more credit than he gets for it, since he had no other Western government saying comparable things, it makes no difference because they know that at the end of the day, they don't really need to worry about a loss of international support, which means they can use their enormous cash reserves and large security states to clamp down on protests without a great deal of fear, either domestically or internationally. In other words, these are reasons why they survive, but they do not mean that they are not challenged. I expect the challenges to continue. I expect the value of Western international cover to go down, the cost of exercising brutal force to go up, and the price of oil maybe go down, although, again, that's something we can talk about. In other words, I don't look at the Gulf and see a bastion of stability. Now, with all of that said, then, let me just say one brief thing about Syria and Iran, because those are two moving parts here which haven't come up as much, and as a foreign policy person or international relations person, I feel a little more comfortable on a little more solid ground here. I mean, I think that what overlays a lot of the international approach to the Gulf is a combination of two things. One, the residual focus on the believed importance of containing Iran and preventing it from getting a nuclear weapon and waging a war, a quiet proxy war, whatever you want to call it, to contain Iranian influence. This is very, very important to the countries in the Gulf. It has been very important at various points in Washington. I think during the Arab Spring, the early Arab Spring, there was some efforts to move past that, but it ran smack into the contradictions posed by the reliance of the United States on the states of the Gulf to basically maintain that containment policy against Iran. In other words, it is very, very difficult to simultaneously reduce your military posture in the region, contain Iran, and push for democratic change in the countries that you're relying upon to contain Iran for you. It doesn't really work that way, which means that without a revision of that prior goal of saying, look, maybe containing Iran isn't what should be the master strategy of the United States and the West are basically trapped by their reliance on the GCC and the states of the Gulf. Now, if the United States were able to strike a deal with Iran, a grand bargain, something which was able to get past the nuclear crisis, that would change. And I think that some of the strongest resistance to striking a negotiated agreement with Iran, a lot of it has come from Tehran, obviously, but a lot of it's come from Riyadh too, and from the countries of the Gulf that recognize that their fortunes would not be improved by a diplomatic resolution between the West and Iran. Then you get Syria.
Israel too, maybe.
And Israel too. We're talking about the Gulf, though. But yes, Israel, of course. And then you get Syria, which I think is going to have the most profound effects on regional security of anything else. I think it has consumed the so-called Arab Spring and is having deep and profound structural effects on the region. In the case of the Gulf, what's interesting about it is that the states of the GCC have taken an unusually aggressive leading role in first diplomatic and then military support for an insurgency in Syria. And their efforts thus far have largely failed. I mean, they've succeeded in terms of helping to drag Syria down into the pit of hell, which it has now become. And again, Assad plays a great deal has the primary responsibility for that as well. But the move towards the funding of an armed opposition was something which was driven in large part out of the Gulf. And I think that this is supported by a media, political, and kind of local level campaign of using religious sectarianism and Islamist mobilization in order to generate support for a jihad in Syria, which is contributing to, I think, the deep and profound use of sectarianism as a way of maintaining control and pressure over potential Shia challengers in the region, while also harnessing potentially discordant Islamist movements like the Sahwa, giving them something to do and giving them some place to direct their energies rather than towards demanding change at home. In other words, whatever happens in Syria, this has actually been quite good for the domestic survival strategies of the Saudis, and for sure, and I suspect also for some of the other Gulf regimes to a lesser extent. And I think that sounds good in the short term. Over the longer term, it's not clear what the effects of this will be. The risk of backlash, the return of the jihadists, the impact of the intensification of sectarian polarization, the impact of failure and division, watching Qatar and watching Doha and Riyadh battle each other over control of the Syrian opposition has not been an edifying spectacle, and I expect to see more of this. And then just the broad effects on the region of Riyadh and Tehran fighting a proxy war in Syria, I think is something which we have to watch very carefully. I think that the effects of this are indirect and profound. Okay, so with all of that said, I get to be the resident house cynic on this. What's going to happen to the 6 states of the GCC? Easy. Saudi Arabia is most likely to surprise. The Bahrain is, I think, radioactive. I see very limited prospects for the Bahraini regime and opposition to overcome its differences, and no sign that the Bahraini regime is interested in doing so. And so I place very low prospects on the Bahraini regime surviving in this form in a 5-year spectrum. I think Qatar is actually one where it's I think Bernie got this exactly right. Qatar's foreign policy is utterly dependent on a single individual, and if he dies or steps down or is deposed, there's no social support for Qatar's foreign policy whatsoever. And so, if you do go to Crown Prince or you go to Tamim, he might decide to say this hasn't been worth it, and decide Qatar is going to become Oman, right? Hide and just be rich and hope no one bothers you. And that's actually not a stupid strategy. And again, so in other words, there's no politics to speak of, and I think you're right about that in Qatar, but the prospect of radical disruptive change in foreign policy is probably highest in Qatar. Kuwait is the most interesting, and I think these battles over parliamentary supervision of the royal family are going to continue, and I actually agree that this is where some of the most interesting change, I think Andrew was pointing this out, is likely to come. I have no insights whatsoever into the UAE, so I won't say anything, or about Oman, although I really do wonder how Oman's going to handle a rapidly impending succession with no designated successor.
Great, thank you, Mark. That was wonderful. I've got a quick sort of follow-up question on something that wasn't completely addressed, and this is the issue of intra-GCC relations and how you see this factoring into their ability to manage domestic change. And might we see a greater closing of the ranks of these states that historically have been marked by tremendous disunity despite their name, the GCC? We're seeing, obviously, foreign policy competition in a number of arenas, but domestically, do you see this becoming more of a factor, their coordination, their cooperation on managing these challenges, and how much should that really matter in terms of their ability to weather the storm? If anyone wants to.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think I mean, there has been, I think, a lot of controversy over the past few months about this new internal security pact that was agreed upon at the GCC summit last December in Manama. And it's especially in Kuwait. The parliament has been, I think, active in trying to pressure the government to disclose what was agreed to. Mm-hmm. And again, this issue that Mark was saying of parliamentary oversight of government affairs. Mm-hmm. What has the government signed up to in the name of the Kuwaiti population? The Kuwaitis refused to sign a previous one in the 1990s. And there's been a lot of debate about whether Kuwait should try and safeguard its greater relative openness relative to some of the Gulf states around it. So, on the other hand, you could then look at the issue that the 6 rulers, and they are really rulers, not states, sitting around that GCC ministerial table. You have 6 individuals unwilling to share power perhaps with their own populations, still less with each other, taking decisions on internal security and indeed closing ranks, but for prioritizing on much more practical issues. They kind of failed on the monetary agreement. They failed on big issues, how to kind of have a consensus on Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood and stuff like that. They failed on other issues, big ticket ones, really focusing on the kind of practical measures to kind of ensure that they are least affected. So this could be the way forward, although again, the Kuwaiti example shows it's not without its problems when you begin to inject domestic politics into that.
Absolutely, yeah. Anything to add?
I mean, I think that, on some issues they seem to have coordinated very well. For instance, there's a consensus on Bahrain, it seems to me, that the Khalifas are to stay and at any cost. Whereas on the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, they're divided. On Iran, they're divided. I mean, especially with Oman as an outlier. And on Syria, it seems, though, however, that they are very likely to all pitch in and fight this proxy war against Iran in Syria. So I think the way to think about how they decide on policy, it's really on a case-by-case basis, rather than some sort of general sort of set of guidelines that will dictate how they will behave.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, we'll open it up to questions now, and we'll take 3 at a time. And as a reminder, please do ask a question.
Yeah, good luck with that.
in the back there, sir. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ala, and I'm from Jordan. I work at the Middle East Institute. I have 2 questions. First to Dr. Heikel. You mentioned some of the weaknesses that the Gulf countries face, that Saudi Arabia faces, and you mentioned some foreign threats from Iraq and Yemen. I was wondering, why wasn't Iran on the list? Do you think there's a good reason why Iran is not as threatening? And to Dr. Lynch, you mentioned that you don't believe in the existence of a certain monarchical exception, and you mentioned that the Gulf countries they have the money to buy lots of people, and otherwise they can arrest and make activists disappear. But if you look at other monarchies in the Arab world, Jordan or Morocco, they don't have the money, and I'd argue that oppression of activists and so on has been very limited since the uprising started. So how would you interpret that? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am, please.
So based on the panels that we... Mervat Hatem, Howard University. The previous panels argued that if you look at the internal picture, it seems like the prospects for a protest movement is limited because of the fragmentation that exists among the different forces. So that women, the young people, have not exactly been able to establish connections that we know got established in the other countries of the Arab Spring. So that leads me to the question, are the foreign policy dimensions enough to sort of undermine these regimes? Because in the absence of these important internal linkages that seem to be absent.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hello, my name is Peter, and I really appreciated all of your statements on the panel. My question, I think, would be for Dr. Lynch, and it would be surrounding you mentioned the impact of Syria on many of the countries in the GCC. My question would be in its kind of connection to Yemen, especially, and how with Yemen and all of its other problems, how it could be profoundly impacted by Syria, and if Yemen's state was to collapse under the terrible state of the economy and influence of Al Qaeda in Yemen very profoundly, what kind of impact would that, do you feel like, have on what you might categorize as the rather stable current positions of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, other places like that?
Great, thank you. Bernie, did you want to start with the...
Yeah, I mean, as far as why I didn't mention Iran as an immediate threat to Saudi Arabia, I meant that I don't think Iran is likely to invade Saudi Arabia with an army. I mean, unless there's some coordination with Iraq. But, I mean, if there is a immediate physical threat to this kingdom, it'll come from Iraq or from Yemen in different forms. The Iranian threat, which is much touted by the Saudi leadership, is more strategic. It's over regional dominance. It's over control of the politics of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. And to some extent, or much smaller extent, Yemen, where Iran is allegedly also involved with the Houthi group or movement in northern Yemen. So I don't think the Saudis think that there's going to be a war with Iran, or at least one that is initiated by Iran, unless, of course, America or Israel attacks Iran, Iran retaliates and hits the Saudi oil fields in the eastern province. I mean, that's another scenario altogether. But the most immediate threats to the kingdom come from Iraq and Yemen, and not from Iran.
Mm-hmm. Great. Mark, did you want to...
On the question about Jordan and Morocco, I mean, I think that there's no common theory that explains that. I don't think. I think you look at Jordan, you look at Morocco. Morocco, the king was probably the savviest of any of the Arab leaders in terms of getting out in front and offering constitutional reforms that divided the political opposition took the wind out of the sails of the protest movement. By the time people, and co-opting the Islamist movement, giving them the prime ministry, by the time people figured out that the constitutional reforms probably didn't really touch the core of monarchical power, I think it was too late to rebuild that kind of early momentum that you had with the February 20th movement. So I think that in Morocco, I mean, basically it was a question of a savvy a king basically outfoxing the opposition, and in a way that no other really, I don't think any other Arab government really was able to do that. And in the case of Jordan, I think it's just that's just what Jordan is, right? I mean, Jordan has been on the brink of collapse basically since 1950. Well, since 1950, and has some pretty well-developed survival strategies for it. Of course, it does have the very strong international support, very similar to what the countries of the Gulf has. It got significant financial assistance from Saudi Arabia and from other Gulf countries, direct budget subventions to help them get through the crisis. I think in Jordan, what you saw was, kind of a frantic, kind of a treadmill of, elections, recycling prime ministers, doing various things. But, Jordan, as you know, as a Jordanian, I mean, it's interesting, right? You have new kinds of protest movements there that are unlike anything I've seen watching it for 25 years now of, these kind of continuous rolling protests in the South. You've got challenges to tribal leadership. You've got linkages between the South and Amman, which are very unusual in Jordanian terms. And so I don't actually think that the Jordanian monarchy is going to fall. That's not what I think the issue is. I think that its political survival strategy is not as effective as it once was, and I think you're going to see that kind of ongoing turbulence there. But in neither case do I think it's simply because of the existence of a king who has more legitimacy than a non-king. I will say that in Jordan, and this kind of gets into the other question, Peter's question, is that in Jordan, again, you might have other thoughts on this, but my sense is most Jordanians I know are looking at Syria and they're terrified of what's happening there. And I was talking to the Jordanian foreign minister not too long ago, and he was projecting that 10% of Jordan's population was going to be Syrian refugees by the end of the year, and I think that's been revised upward since then. So I think if you're a Jordanian right now, kind of pushing the king to the mat might not be at the top of your priority list, even if you're disappointed or disenchanted with the level of political reform. And then the question about Yemen, that's a good one. It's hard for me to see the direct connections between Syria and Yemen. I think Syria is reshaping the entire region and probably intensifying stressors in all different places. To the extent that anybody in the international community is bothering to provide humanitarian assistance anymore, that's now all going to Syria. But my understanding of what's happening in Yemen is that the UN mediator is continuing to try and shepherd the national dialogue and see where that goes. But I think the direct effects of Syria and Yemen are kind of hard for me to parse out. I wish I had a better answer.
Great. Christian, do you want to say anything now?
There's a question I think about the fragmentation of opposition forces, which is an interesting one. I mean, in Kuwait, for example, the current political setup, well, current since 1960s, I suppose, is that kind of individual MPs are very much competing with each other to become kind of mini providers of patronage to their constituencies, which explains some of the populist recent initiatives in Kuwait. I think from a Gulf ruler's point of view, the fragmentation of opposition has been, that explains the kind of nightmare they faced in Bahrain with the February 14 uprising 2 years ago, when for a short period of time at least it appeared that social groups from across the spectrum were coming together in support of a kind of non-sectarian platform of meaningful change to the structure of power and demands of accountability from their rulers, and kind of overcoming those artificially divisive, fragmented lines that had been hammered home for so many years. And that, I guess, in many ways also explains the kind of the response that followed and the kind of sectarianization of the uprising that then took place, and the kind of classic continuation of this policy of fragmenting oppositions to prevent any unifying social movement from really taking root and developing. And the speed with which that began to take place, so I think was really, really quite frightening.
Yes, Kristen. Yeah.
I wanted to take that point that. Oh, thanks. I want you to take the point that Mark brought up, because I agree with him that Syria is just looming so large and taking up so much of the oxygen in the region and the money and the concentration, and even the opposition movements are looking that way. I mean, a lot of things that were going domestic are now looking to Syria. And we have Hezbollah obviously directly entering into the Syrian conflict. We have a question mark about Iraq, how unstable that state is and how they can also be brought into the conflict. We have potentially a huge swath of the Middle East that could be quite engaged in this war. I mean, really engaged in the war. And I wanted to throw that scenario, which is starting to become reality, back, and particularly at Bernie, and your point about how much the Saudi state really can control all of the state, and especially the Islamic field. Because as we really see the intensification of sectarianism and the actual mobilization now, I mean, through Hezbollah and through some jihadis going there into Syria, I'm just wondering what your sense is of the Saudis, how they're viewing this. I mean, is this something that they're really worried about? Are they trying to stop this, control it? Is it something that they're instrumentalizing and see a positive force? And just how do you see them dealing with this sort of Islamist mobilization within the state?
Yes, please. It's coming. Yeah.
My name's Chris Brown from Duke University. I wanted to ask a quick question about Bahrain. So since the beginning of the uprisings in 2011, the Khalifa regime has pretty consistently invoked the specter of Iran and alleged Iranian meddling. As the new rounds of dialogue kind of continue to fail and the range of options for the Shia opposition seems to get narrower, do you think that this could become a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy in which the Shia opposition does begin to reach out to Iran?
Please.
Jonathan Broder from Congressional Quarterly. I'd also like to ask a question about Bahrain. I had a conversation just the other day with Admiral Dennis Blair, who used to be the Director of National Intelligence. And he also agrees with you, Mark, about the inherent instability in Bahrain. And he suggested that the United States consider moving the base, the Navy base that we have in Bahrain, to a flagship offshore, simply because Bahrain is going to become too unstable and the future of the base would come into question. I'd like to get the opinion of the panel on whether you all think that is a prudent idea.
Thank you. Okay. Bernie, we'll start out with you on the Syria question. Yeah, thanks.
My sense of how the Saudis view Syria and the opposition is that there was a real division, and there still is a division between the Saudis and the Qataris over the Muslim Brothers. And the Qataris also were willing to fund all the opposition groups in Syria, including radical jihadi types. The Saudis, my understanding, broke with the Qataris on this issue, on this very issue, both the jihadis and the Muslim Brotherhood, and then started sending their funding and their arms through Jordan to nationalist forces in Syria and not to Islamists, because they have their problems with the Muslim Brotherhood, and also because they are afraid of blowback with the jihadis. The problem, though, that the Saudis face, and this is a problem that I think the United States also faces, is that the ones who are doing the heavy lifting in Syria, who are willing to die, are the jihadis. They're the ones who can take on Hezbollah, not, it seems, the other forces. And so at some point, a decision will have to be made as to whether to fund these and to arm them. A lot of the funding and the arming has been coming from informal, non-governmental sources, mainly from Kuwait, but also the UAE and Saudi Arabia, to these jihadis. But I don't think the Saudis have worked their way through this problem. And I don't necessarily think also that there is a solution to it. You have to go with, you have to work with what you have in Syria, and it's a hard one. Can I address the last question about the naval base? So at one point, I think it was a year or so ago, the Saudi king mentioned, revived the idea of unification of the GCC. And I think this was read widely as code for taking over Bahrain and amalgamating it to the kingdom, not in kind of over some sort of gradual process that would take many years. But there's no way ever that the Saudi royal family will permit Shias to come to power in Bahrain, ever. So I don't see why, given that, Americans have to worry about the base. And lastly, the question about the Shias in Bahrain and whether they will. There's no question that as you block all avenues to the Shia opposition in Bahrain, they will inevitably become radicalized, and and they are put in a very difficult situation where they will have to turn more and more to Iran. Now, the Bahraini Khalifa regime and the Saudi regime will tell you, even if you were to give the more power to the moderate Shias, sooner or later the nasties will eliminate the moderates, and they will come to dominate, just like Hezbollah has dominated Shia politics in southern Lebanon, and that's sort of part of the internal dynamics of Shia politics. So why open that door in the first place?
It's like in reverse order on the Bahrain, Jonathan, your question. I mean, I guess Saudi Arabia refusing for it to happen doesn't mean that it won't happen. I mean, they refused to have Bashar al-Assad remain in power, and he's still there. I mean, again, there's what you want and there's what you can achieve. And if you actually see the sudden upsurge and rise in mass-scale protest again, and also consider this, that it's not just, Hezbollah. It's not just like the self-fulfilling prophecy of them, getting support from Iran. I think it's a region-wide phenomenon. People look around and they say that, nonviolent protest isn't really working very well in most places, and in Syria and in Libya, violent protest is getting you international intervention. I mean, it works in both directions. And so, I don't think it's that far-fetched to imagine Bahrain being consumed in genuinely troubling and violent conflict, regardless of whether moderate Shia in Bahrain want it, Saudi Arabia wants it, the Khalifa want it. My perspective on the base question, Jonathan, is that we should absolutely be thinking about relocating it, and that even if we don't relocate it immediately, the very fact that we would seriously consider it should be used as leverage over the Al Khalifa to make serious reforms, because I see no sign whatsoever that they have been interested in any form of accountability or trying to come to terms with what's happened to the country in the last 2 years. And I think at a certain point, if you're looking at something which is unstable, uncertain, and could go in a very bad direction, I'm not saying that they should be packing up the base tomorrow, but I think having this openly discussed is only to the good, and especially if it's a credible threat, which I think it should be. On the question of Syria's impact and the questions about how that plays out in Saudi policy, and I think, Bernie, you got it exactly right. I think in terms of what the tensions were and the issues were between the Saudis and the Qataris on this, and this has been pretty widely aired. I would say that I think the model, probably, my guess is that the model for a Saudi support for Syrian insurgency is probably Afghanistan in the 1980s, right, where you were able to have, you basically stand up the insurgency, you coordinate with neighboring governments to make sure the flows go through. You don't maybe have direct control over it, and you end up funding lots of guys who are going to be nasty, but they're going to be effective and get the job done. And as you're doing this, you then help to position yourself within the leadership region-wide of this kind of this very popular, at least in the constituencies you care about, regional and international campaign, all with the approval of the West, thereby proving your usefulness to them in this domain. And if at the end of the day, you end up bleeding the Soviets and bleeding the Iranians, maybe Assad falls and Syria turns into Somalia and the Levant, like Lakhdar Brahimi warns about. Well, so what? I mean, you've accomplished your goals, if those are what your goals are. And so again, my reading of what the model is probably something along those lines. A lot of benefits to that, and seems to be at least what's manifesting over the last 6 months.
Yeah, there are points.
Just the issue of Iran and Bahrain is interesting, I think, in the sense that the attribution of Iranian meddling is a way of externalizing the root causes of socio-economic and political grievance and stripping them of any local content. And if you look at the Gulf-wide phenomenon, that was kind of Iran was the kind of scapegoat in 2011. It's interesting how that's gradually been replaced by the Muslim Brotherhood, especially in the Emirates and in Saudi Arabia. There's always a convenient kind of external scapegoat to try and ensure that prying eyes are not focused too much on some of the domestic issues that people would rather not have openly discussed. And so I think perhaps after Iran, after the Brotherhood, I guess the question is what's next?
If I could just follow up on this Fifth Fleet question, this issue of linking our security assistance, our arms, to progress on internal reform, I'd be interested in your thoughts on going down that path, because this idea of we're going to pull up, move, and that will send a signal that will spur them to reform. I mean, that's a obviously compelling hypothesis. Has it been proven? And what's to say that they may not dig in further? We know from a fact with the strategic pause in arms sales to Bahrain that was intended to precisely do this, they simply went to other suppliers. And I'd be interested just sort of broadly how you see linkages to this massive arms package that we gave to Saudi Arabia is often touted. It came in the wake of the uprisings, that it was sort of back to business as usual. I mean, these are arms that are intended for external defense, and yet a lot of people, I think, link them to the notion that somehow the U.S. is supporting the internal status quo. And should we be using that external aid to affect domestic changes? I'd be interested. Anyone? Yeah.
Should we or are we? Because clearly we're not.
Right. So, what are your thoughts? Yeah.
Well, I think we should be, but I think for reasons that I've laid out. But.
Okay.
But you're right, by the way, that there's no guarantee that this will work, because. I'm curious your thoughts on this, Bernie, also, and Christian, because I think there's a very interesting combination that I hear in the Gulf of, on the one hand, this kind of feeling, as you've described, that in this post-American world, we can, we're strong, we can get support anywhere, combined with a very, very strong fear of abandonment.
Sure, right.
And this kind of dual kind of attitude towards this is something which is very interesting, and I think not enough attention has been paid to how that might work diplomatically.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm curious that you describe the arms sales as aid. I mean, this is Saudi Arabia spending $30
yeah, okay, that's right. Right. Yeah.
In hard-earned currency, right? I mean, they're buying a constituency in the United States
sure, that's fair enough,
with these purchases. And I think they're largely for U.S. forces to use. I mean, they're there for U.S. forces to use them in the eventuality that Saudi Arabia needs to be defended.
No, they're the aircraft. They're the F-15. I mean,
yeah, a lot
there's
of
a
them,
huge it's a huge package of. I mean, it's
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of it can be also used by America should we ever have to go in again, like we did once, to defend the place. So I just don't see the relation, regardless of what people think or say or how often they mention China as a possible alternative. The relationship is with the United States remains strong, strategic, and unchanged as far as I can tell.
Mm.
I suppose from a U.S. perspective, that's probably true. I guess from a European perspective, with less of that massive U.S. presence behind it in the Gulf and in general, The issue is that the Gulf states know where the balance of power potentially is shifting, in the sense that some of the European states need the Gulf more than the Gulf needs them. So they've been showing themselves willing and able to actually exert leverage the other way around. If, for example, the European Parliament passing a resolution on the UAE crackdown was met with absolute fury in the UAE and threats and expulsions of several organizations from the UAE. So there has been a kind of reverse form of pressure and leverage. Now that obviously is not a US kind of conundrum, it's more of a European one. But in the UK, for example, I mean, the government in the UK is very much focused on kind of not rocking the boat, on not really having any form of leverage, because they do want to maximize military sales, for example, and British commerce and trade with the Gulf at the expense perhaps of some of the other aspects of the relationship. And that really speaks to the kind of age of austerity that we're living in, especially in the European Union, and the fact that these Gulf states have a lot of investment and jobs that they can plow into European economies, and they're not slow, I think, in reminding people in Europe, at least, of that possibility.
Questions? Yes, in the back. A little louder? Yeah.
Hello, my name is Melissa Zenis. I want to thank you all for assembling for this panel. It's been a wonderful experience. And my question, to somewhat divert from more of the geostrategic or economic discussions that have thus transpired, I'm intrigued by, Dr. Heikel, if you could comment in this regard, the implications of this current projected stability debate on the Gulf or the GCC nations more broadly, in terms of how that tracks with evolutions in Salafi ideology and more of the intellectual legacy from which a lot of these hyphenated political, religious, and social movements can come to manifest themselves. I think that a lot of the focus has been on, how certain authoritarian regimes are going to manipulate or strategize or kind of optimally fragment their respective demographics, but from an intellectual perspective, as groups that are trying to seek a third way or an alternative to political mobilization, should such be the case, how does that parse with the Salafi Wahhabi intellectual tradition and ways of reimagining modes of civic participation, should such a thing exist in the GCC?
Should I answer that? Or?
Thank you. No, we're try to do more. Two more. Any other questions? One in the...
Hi, Rachel Peterson, ADHRB. I'd like to push you guys a little more on how the Syrian conflict in particular will affect Bahrain. I think that there could be a really interesting dynamic with Saudi Arabia supplying aid to the Syrian rebels. There's a possible opening for Syrian government to potentially work with Bahrain opposition. I mean, this is completely outside of the realm of the norm, but this is something that I think that the Bahrain government has started to use in saying that, what's going on in Syria might come over and affect what's going on in Bahrain. I would just love to hear what you guys think about that.
Any others? Okay. Yeah, Bernie.
There's one.
Oh, the one I didn't see. Sorry. Yeah, there you go.
Oh, thanks. David Newton, Middle East Institute and ex-diplomat. We've talked a little bit about it, but we've listed all the challenges facing the Saudi regime, a long list. And then we look at the team in Saudi Arabia, 90-year-plus king, an elderly crown prince, perhaps mentally challenged, number 3 in the government at least, who's perhaps a placeholder to hold off this difficult idea of succession. Doesn't look like a very good team. We don't know who the next one line will be. He's somewhere there, but they haven't wanted to face that yet. Doesn't look like a very good prognosis for facing all these problems. And I wondered what your prognosis is for the Saudi regime, the princes, to really deal with all these very difficult problems.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
The question on the Salafi Wahhabi political tradition and its relationship to the Saudi state. Salafis basically come in 2 varieties, okay? You have the majority are politically quietist. They don't get involved in politics at all. They just obey the ruler unless he commands them to perform a sin, in which case they're ethically not supposed to follow the command. The other type of Salafi is a activist Salafi, politically engaged Salafi. And the activist Salafi comes in two varieties again. You have the jihadi and the more Muslim Brotherhood-oriented activist. Now the jihadi Al-Qaeda type basically says the following. Ruler, you're not ruling according to Islamic law. You're an infidel, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to resort to violence in order to change the nature of the regime. That has not worked in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia destroyed Al-Qaeda domestically and very effectively under the leadership of a young prince, and I'll come to him in a minute. What's interesting in Saudi Arabia today is that between those two extremes of total obedience and radical violence, you have a middle stream emerging, a new group that is represented by a number of intellectuals and scholars, including the two who were arrested, Abdullah al-Hamid and Qahtani, who are basically not posing things in such dramatically stark terms, and are asking in Islam, in an Islamic idiom, and using an Islamic framework for better governance, greater transparency. And I think that there's something very interesting going on here, because it's not the Muslim Brotherhood type language, nor is it the jihadi language. And I think this is something that's worth watching. And it's not clear what its future is, but it's definitely a third way in the Salafi political universe. In terms of the princes and their ages, you're right, and that the king is quite old and the crown prince is also old. But the man who runs the country domestically is the Minister of the Interior, who's in his early 50s. And the man who runs the king's office, Tuwaijri, is also fairly young. So, you do have a youngish cohort actually in control of the country, in control of the daily operations in the country. And foreign affairs is divided between different individuals, and again, they're all relatively young. So, it's not fair to describe the system as sort of decrepit and senile, right? It's a bit more complicated than that. Yes. And and in fact, this younger leadership that's emerged only recently, fairly recently, is quite dynamic, and has certainly, is effective.
Any other comments? Did you want to comment?
It's true that there is a quiet generational succession underway, and kind of perhaps below the surface in Saudi among the ruling family elites, and that, I guess, will make its way upwards through the ranks as the kind of people at the top begin to die away. We haven't really... One focus, I think, which might be interesting is the first succession in this post-Arab Spring environment of intense transparency and accountability and discussion on social media. And if there's a succession, how will it be received by the kind of people? And will they kind of be asking for more of a say in choosing whom is going to rule them? I'm just throwing that out as one area that might be quite interesting to watch. We haven't had a succession yet since the whole Arab Spring and the kind of ruler for life mentality began to break down, at least in North Africa. The effect of Syria and Bahrain, the Syria crisis has now become militarized to an extent that, as you say, rulers in the Gulf are kind of saying, well, is this really what we want? This kind of issue of stability at the expense of this terrible, tragic violence is definitely one that they're playing along. I think also the messy transition in Egypt, the kind of inability of the Muslim Brotherhood to necessarily convince people across the region that they're any better of an alternative, is also something that's being played upon in Gulf capitals, and to a great extent, Again, perhaps just a thought, but should popular peaceful protests in Turkey really develop, it could again kind of try and recapture some of that spirit of possibility that we saw in 2011 for a few short months, which seems a long time ago now. So I guess that's what I'd have to say about that.
On the Salafi issue, I just one thing to think about is Egypt, and it's not just the Muslim Brotherhood's failure and kind of the Saudi and Emirati-led kind of anti-Brotherhood mobilization, but it's also just the experience of Egyptian Salafis in politics and whether they see that as a productive and beneficial experience or not. I think right now it's leaning towards not. And where that leads them, back to quiescence, towards violence, towards some kind of new doctrine of democracy, I know no one really knows, but I think that's kind of interesting. But then as soon as I say that, I think back to all of it. I must have read 100 articles in the mid-2000s about how the rise of Iraqi democracy and the rise of Ali Sistani was going to transform the Iranian views of democracy and religious authority, and that didn't seem to happen. So, so maybe those effects will be exaggerated. On the Rachel's question about Syria and Bahrain, right. There's so many things that could happen in this right now. That's just one of like this vast catalog of potentially negative possibilities. The one that most worries me is one that's outside the bounds of this panel or this conference, and that's Iraq, where just the increasing interactions between the Iraqi Sunni insurgency in the Syrian Jabhat al-Nusra just strikes me as a fundamentally new factor in Iraqi politics and Iraqi security that needs to be paid attention to. But Bahrain, I would just throw that onto the pile of the many ways in which Syria is reshaping the region in negative directions.
You spoke about Al-Hamid and Al-Qahtani as new faces for the Salafism. I heard from a Saudi activist, he refused to consider Suleiman al-Rushdi. He is much more, can be under this title, to be a Salafist anymore, because they were considering him as representing a modern Islam in Saudi Arabia. So my question is about those new players in Saudi Arabia. For example, if we talk the youth sectors, for example, if we have a soccer match between two teams in Saudi Arabia, those crowds really are linked with Salafism anymore? Where can you categorize the new generation of Saudis?
Mm-hmm. Great. Yes, Ambassador,
Barbara Bodine, former diplomat and currently a colleague of Bernie's up at Princeton. And first of all, I'd like to thank two of your professors for providing books for my students to read every single semester. So thank you both. And Bernie, we work together on these things. I want to bring up a proposition to answer the question on the Yemen-Syria link. And I will completely agree that Yemen is very much a sideshow to what is going on with Syria. It's not a major player. And would certainly also agree that to the extent that there's an immediate impact, it's the diversion of assistance and attention, although Yemen does better when it's able to operate without a great deal of attention. But there's one element of it that I've been kind of curious about, and I haven't come to a conclusion. The Iranians really don't have an interest in Yemen fundamentally. They've made noises about the Houthis. Sistani's made noises about the Houthis. But this isn't really their fight. But as a number of you have mentioned, the Saudi-Iranian proxy tension is very real, played out most specifically in Syria. To what extent would you see this apparent uptick in Iranian involvement in Yemen as much a way of prodding the Saudis. The Saudis are going after Iran's major client, Syria, to the extent that the Iranians can make life more difficult in Yemen. That's a distraction for the Saudis. It gets at what is Saudi Arabia's really soft underbelly. And so it's not a major war, it's not going to be a major proxy war, but it's a way of reminding the Saudis that we can make life difficult for you on all of your borders. This is just a proposition for your comments.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take those since we're wrapping up anyway. So, go ahead.
Thanks, Barbara, for adding to our catalog of horrors. I think it's an excellent point. I hadn't really thought about it that way. Thanks.
Okay, so first, in terms of Al-Hamid and others, a number of these individuals, of course, have a history, right? So they come out of the Sahwa, so kind of a Muslim Brotherhood background. And what I see in Saudi Arabia, it's mostly on the internet. These are people publishing sometimes very long works, actually, on the internet. New names and arguing and using an Islamic. I mean, these are scholars. Many of them actually have a good grounding in Islamic scholarship, and they're presenting a new model of politics that is specifically targeted for Saudi Arabia, where you're working within an Islamic, let's call it a constitutional framework, an Islamic constitutional framework. And these voices are still individuals, and I'm not sure they will ever become a social movement, whether there will become a movement. But as far as football or soccer and the new generation, I don't know. In Arabic, there's this wonderful expression that says "nisful ilmi la a'lamu," which means half of all knowledge is I don't know, quote unquote. So I really don't know how religion and soccer interact in the kingdom. It's a worthy topic for a dissertation, certainly. But I haven't seen. The few times I went to soccer matches in Saudi Arabia, I didn't see a religious inflection to the different groups or camps. It's people just go for different teams for all kinds of reasons. Some tribal, others neighborhoods, and so on. And then, with respect to the Houthis and Iran, I do think that the Iranians are actually trying to find every possible way in which to prod and inflame and irritate the Saudis. The one thing I should say about Iran, though, and Saudi Arabia, and having just come back from Lebanon and when the Qusayr thing was happening, is that the Iranians are all in this battle, and they're professionals. The Hezbollah has been fighting Israel for 30 plus years now. So, they even though they're a minority numerically, the Shias of Lebanon and vis-a-vis the Sunnis of, the greater Syria, they're very serious professional people. And we can see that they won that battle. And I think that on the other side, whether it's the Syrian opposition that is very fragmented and nowhere near having the level of professionalism of Hezbollah, or whether it's the patrons back in the Gulf, I don't think that anyone on the other side, on the Sunni side, as it were, has that level of professionalism and seriousness, or is in fact all in till the bitter end, like I think the Iranians and Hezbollah are. So if I were a betting person, which is the conclusion of my remark, if I were a betting person speaking today, seeing how the forces are arrayed, I would bet on the Iranians and the Shias trouncing the Syrian opposition.
Boy, today just gets better and better.
On that optimistic note, I guess. This brings us to the end of the conference. I wanted to thank everyone for attending on this Friday afternoon. I wanted to thank our co-sponsors, POMED. I especially wanted to thank our panelists for traveling here and for providing what I think we can all agree was a very stimulating and enriching discussion of these important issues. This conference could not have happened without a number of people working behind the scenes, both at Carnegie and POMED. I would like to recognize them. It may sound like an Oscar acceptance speech, but I think it's important because there were a lot of people involved. Tiffany Tupper and Amber Kirtley were absolutely crucial on logistics. Mukhtar Awad, Saskia Brackenmacher, Alex Siegel were working the mics. Michelle Altenberg was our social media genius on this. And from POMED, Alex Russell and Todd Ruffner. If you would please join me in thanking them for their assistance in this. And thank you all for coming, and safe travels to wherever you're going. Thanks.
Good to see you.